in my mind, those guys are getting ready to go do what I used to do. They're getting ready to go overseas and be at the tip of the spear. And I wanted them to be the absolute sharpest they can be, so that if for some reason they end up in a shooting war with whoever, China, North Korea, Russia, whoever, I want them to have the confidence that they know how their adversaries are going to perform in real world.
Hello and welcome to the Fighter Pilot Podcast. I'm your host, Vincent Aiello, call sign Jello, and joining me in studio today is Jack Stewart. Jack, how you doing today?
I'm doing great. I'm in sunny San Diego. Get to sit down and talk with you about fighter jets, so I'm doing awesome.
Fantastic. Yeah, we're going to talk about Top Gun and a whole bunch of cool stuff, and you go by Farley.
I go by Farley. Yeah,
all right.
I have since I was a wee J.O. back in VFA 87.
Well, let's hear about that. Where'd you get your start? Where are you from? Where'd you go to school? Tell us about your military career and maybe a little bit about what you're doing now.
Yeah, well, I grew up in a suburb of Seattle, Washington.
Okay.
Grew up in an aviation family. My mom's dad was a B-17 pilot in World War II.
Wow.
My dad was a private pilot his entire life, got his license at age 16, so I grew up going to air shows and just hanging out at the FBO and going for airplane rides with my dad before I could even see over the dash. But it was a surprise to them when I told them I wanted to go to the Naval Academy. I just read an article in Boys Life magazine about King Hall, where all 4,000 midshipmen eat at once. And I just one day when I was 8 years old said, "Mom and Dad, I'm going to the Naval Academy." And they were like, "What? You're doing what?" So sure enough, I wrote to the Naval Academy every single year from age 8 until finally they sent back an application instead of a, "Hey, you're too young to apply." Mm-hmm. And that's where I went to the Naval Academy. 4 years there and graduated in 1999, selected for Navy pilot, went to the Navy pilot training program, Pensacola, Corpus Christi, Kingsville, Texas, and ended up in F-18s and did a couple tours with VF-87, VF-82, and then eventually transitioned to the reserves. That's where I finished out.
Okay. Now, but don't be too modest. You must have done well in high school because I also applied to the Naval Academy. I got a different letter than you got, which was thanks but no thanks, punk. Yeah. So you must have done pretty well. I mean, that's a competitive place to get in.
It is. And, when you're 8 and you decide that's where you're going to go, maybe my sole focus on everything I did was what do I need to do to get in the Naval Academy? So it said I needed to be an athlete. So I was like, well, I guess I better start doing something. So I started running, started swimming, and was a varsity athlete. I said student government, so I ran for every office I could. I needed to have good grades, so I studied hard and, it just... Test scores. Yeah, I just did everything I could to get in. It was just my sole focus.
Good for you.
Yeah.
Yeah, very cool. And then did you have any flight experience when you went to flight school?
I did.
You talked about seeing over the dash and all that.
Yeah. So when I was a senior in high school, my parents offered to say, hey, you can either join this swim team or we'll pay for you to get your license. And at the time, being 17, 18 years old, I said, oh, I want to be a swimmer. So I said, I'm going to join the swim team and this club swim team. And it was the worst decision I ever made. But when I came back after my plebe year at the Naval Academy, my parents, I guess, realized that maybe I made a mistake and they offered me, hey, do you want to get your license? So I spent a summer, got my private license, flew every single day. And people who haven't been to Seattle might think that it's always rainy. Well, in the summertime, that summer was beautiful. Not a cloud in the sky. Flew every day and went back to the Naval Academy with my license, joined the flying team, and basically it was just an excuse for the Navy to pick up my flying tab. But I had about 200 hours before I started Navy flight training. Okay.
Because I've had a couple guests on the show lately that had various levels of experience, and they said it really helped them through primary, about the time intermediates and advanced, that everybody kind of catches up. But at least your stomach's used to it.
Right.
And you know what to do when you click the radio mic and how to talk and VFR and some of the VMC rules and all that.
Yeah,
right, cool.
I'd say it helped with the first couple weeks in primary flight training. After that, it was level playing field.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, well, hold on. At one point in your career, though, you must have gone out to Fallon because I wore the shirt special for today. Yeah. Now, I went through and spent some years there, and this logo on my chest here shows the patch I wore. The patch you wore looked a little different.
Yes. Yeah. So I was one of the few that got the white rocker underneath it that said Adversary. and it came a little bit later in my career. So normally, after your first sea tour, you're going to get chosen to be at the weapons school or on staff at Top Gun or a few other billets around the Navy, and you go through the course as a fighter. As an adversary, I went to I did a little bit later in my life, we'll say. So after my first sea tour, I went and was an instructor down in Kingsville in the T-45.
Okay.
And then from there, I did an Admiral's Aid job in New Orleans with the Navy Reserve Forces Admiral. And that's about the time when they said, hey, the reserves have Hornets too. And there happened to be a squadron in New Orleans. And the Admiral was a very good guy and said, hey, I want you to get back into flying. So I'm going to send you out to Lemoore, send you through a CAT other syllabus to get you current again in the F-18, and then you can fly with VFA 204 as a guest pilot. So I did that for my year as an Admiral's Aide.
Nice.
It was pretty awesome because I'd have the squadron call me and say, hey, what are you doing today? Not much. Let me go talk to the Admiral. And, hey, Admiral, they want me to go fly. He said, okay, bye, Jack. See you later. So.
Cool.
So I got to go fly with VFA 204, went to Alaska with them to do a Northern Edge exercise as a guest pilot. And it was just a great time. And so when it became time for me to leave the Admiral's Aid job, I applied to be FTS. It's called TAR now. It used to be TAR before it was FTS, but basically active duty reservist. And so I got picked up for that and joined 204 as a full-time reservist.
Okay.
And that was a time when I went to Top Gun and got to get my adversary patch.
Okay. Are you still full-time reserve, or are you?
No, I'm retired now.
Okay.
Yeah, I retired last year.
Okay.
Yeah.
And what else are you doing? You're doing a little writing, which we'll talk about here.
Yeah.
But, what else are you doing?
Yeah, so I was a full-time reservist for a couple years.
Okay.
I did a deployment to Afghanistan as a JTAC with a Tactical Air Control Party. And when I got back from that, I decided it was time for me to leave the Navy full-time. So that's when I became a selected reservist, so a part-time reservist with 204. And kind of stiff-armed the whole airline thing for a couple of years. I didn't want to fly a bus after flying, fighters for so long. So so I went into business, realized I didn't like working for a living, so I decided to go back into aviation. And so I became an airline pilot. So that's my full-time job now.
Okay.
As you probably well know, being an airline pilot, you do have a lot of downtime, and so I decided I wanted to start writing books. So I'm full-time airline pilot, part-time writer, maybe full-time writer eventually.
Okay. Well, we'll talk about your first book here at the end, but I want to get back to this idea of patches can look a little different.
Yeah.
There's another one with the rocker, as you called it, that says controller.
Yes.
And maybe that's a different day, but you went through the adversary course. So
Yes.
if you and I had gone through together, we might have gone through at the same time, but we'd almost be on different sides of the equation, right?
Right.
So describe that a little bit. What is the adversary course, and how does it differ from the usual? And we've talked about it here on this show before. The strike fighter tactics instructor would be like the normal, not normal, I shouldn't say, but the usual, if you will, Top Gun patch.
Yes. Yeah. So so you mentioned the controller. That's the other one. So you have all three groups going through a class at the same time, and everyone has a different job to do. So in the BFM phase, so when we're doing just 1v1, 2v1 dogfighting, it's exactly the same. So the fighters and the adversaries are going to do the briefing labs. They're going to go out and do the sorties, and they're basically with the emphasis on how to be an instructor, right? So you as a blue patch wearer is going to be the same as me as a red patch wearer, and how we're going to instruct BFM. It's just when we do it and how we do it once we're graduates is a little bit different. So most adversary instructors, like myself, would teach RAG students how to BFM. So we go down to Key West a lot when VFA 106 would come down there and do 1v1 or 2v1 with them. But once the BFM phase was over, the rest of it, that's when you said we're on opposite sides. So as an adversary student, I would be in charge of all the red air, all the bad guys for an event. So it's broken up into two phases: the two-ship phase, the section fighter phase, and then the four-ship or division. And each mission is going to have a different objective. And so I would know, okay, for this mission, they're looking for threat replications of this type of aircraft.
Because there's a scenario.
There's an absolute scenario, yeah. So whether it be a self-escort strike, where you've got two fighters that are going to try to ingress to a target, fight their way in, drop their bombs, and egress, or whether it's a sweep, where they're going to clear out any kind of hostile aircraft before a strike element behind them. It's very crawl, walk, run mentality. And so it's kind of funny going through as an adversary because we would develop the game plan that the fighters would then have to counter. And at least in my class, we like to, give our fighter buds a little bit of a heads up. So I would put my game plan kneeboard card in my box in the lounge, and they knew it was there. But more importantly, every day, because the adversary would do the mass brief, he would ask questions of the day, and he would pick somebody to say, tell me about whatever the threat of the day was.
Right.
Whatever.
Because there's some sort of envelope maybe you want to memorize and be able to recite.
Right. It's like the SAN 6, for example.
Okay.
You want to know what ships are carried on, whatever. And so I would put down what fighter I was going to ask that question. And I remember one day I had the kneeboard card in my box. I had the game plan there for them. I had the questions of the day. And I called on the guy I said I was going to call on. And he obviously wasn't prepared because as he's answering, he's looking at his hand where he'd written the answers. And in the back of the room, you could see all the Top Gun bros like click their pens and start writing notes. So it doesn't always work out, but so we progressed through as a class just with the red air on one side and the blue on the other.
Yeah. So if Hollywood had a chance at this, right, you just totally dashed their dreams because they would want, I would think, a lot of conflict between, like, again, if you and I were going through together, like, Farley, I can't believe you did that scenario, blah, blah, blah. But the point is, right, the bros help each other out.
Yeah.
And that's just a term regardless of gender. But and the idea is that you've got a side of it to do and the blue has a side to do.
Yep.
And you said, by the way, blue patch and red patch. The colors aren't different, but the point being we have blue air, which are the good guys, if you, in a sense, doing the tactics that we use, and you're simulating the other side.
Right.
Yeah, okay.
Right.
Now, why do we need, and you and I know this well, but for those who maybe don't, why do we need professional, quote-unquote, adversaries anyway? Yeah,
I mean, I think the answer to that is when I looked at my role as an adversary and when I would do training after I went through the course and I would go out, let's say out here to San Diego, and support a Com2X where there's a air wing on a carrier. And in my mind, those guys are getting ready to go do what I used to do. Mm-hmm. They're getting ready to go overseas and be at the tip of the spear. And I wanted them to be the absolute sharpest they can be, so that if for some reason they end up in a shooting war with whoever, China, North Korea, Russia, whoever, I want them to have the confidence that they know how their adversaries are going to perform in real world. And so I took my job very seriously, and I think that's why we need to have professional adversaries or aggressors in the Air Force, is we need to have somebody that looks into the latest intelligence of how our threat nations, how our adversaries are training, how they're fighting, and then give our fighters the best chance of success if it ends up into a shooting war.
Yeah. No, I think that's exactly it, right? Is we assess the other side, if you will, and we say, how do we think they're going to do it, and what limitations maybe do they have based on aircraft or rules or whatever, and then we want to simulate that the best we can, because our blue tactics are based on what we know about them, and if our blue guys are doing their job right, you as a red air pilot might get quote unquote killed, right? In training, obviously, it's all simulated. But is there a pride issue there for you? I mean,
a little bit.
Does that hurt after a while?
It does initially. Initially when you're if you're doing the big exercise and you see a fighter and you roll in on them, you're like, yes, it's fun. Like I'm gonna slay this guy. And then when they kill me, I'm like, wait a second, that shouldn't happen. But at the same time, remembering the big picture, I want them to kill me.
That's right.
Right? I want them to be good enough to beat me, and not to get slayed in the real world.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
So I did a handful of red air. In fact, I did probably mostly red air when I was on the Top Gun staff, 2000 to 2002, and I got to the point where I almost got bummed out when I killed a fighter or been behind them, because something broke down, right? So they didn't do something right, or I was unobserved, or something happened, and it's a real bummer in the debrief when Showtime 1-3 is killed, and now there's, right? Because these are, like you said, these are people that are in our squadrons, and if the balloon goes up someday and this really happens, there could be some fatalities.
Yeah, absolutely. I definitely remember there were times when I would go into the debrief feeling so bad for whoever the student was, and I'm like, man, I just wish he had got me. You know?
Yeah. But to your point, in the moment, it's kind of fun
Right.
because this is what we do as aviators.
Right.
Now, you said something else I'd been wanting to ask, and I don't know the answer to this. Maybe, hopefully you do. Adversaries, aggressors,
Yeah.
are those just happy, glad? Are they the same thing or are they different?
They're basically the same thing. So
Okay.
Navy and Marine Corps refer to them as adversaries. Air Force refers to them as aggressors.
Okay.
But it's semantics, really. They mean the exact same thing. I do know if you were to talk to an Air Force guy and you would ask him if he'd done any adversary, he would say, oh, yeah. Because even though there's not a professional aggressor, they maybe will go out and augment to be Red Air for an in-house training event or for another unit. And so that's kind of how they view being Red Air, but not professional Red Air, not being a full-time Red Air.
Yeah. Well, and it reminds me of, for example, when I was a junior officer in VFA 86, we were in the same air wing as 82, by the way. We might go out and do, again, Red Air for 82,
Right.
or we might even have 4 of our own and 2 on each side, and we might even alternate.
Right.
Yeah, on runs 1 and 3 it will be the good guys, on runs 2 and 4 will be the bad guys.
Yep.
And you have the special instructions so everybody knows, again, what threat are we pretending to be?
Right.
What capability do they have? Are they somewhat defensive and maybe a little bit, I don't know, not shy, but I don't know what else to call it, but not as aggressive? Or are they really out to, get you kind of thing? So all that factors into the way that the Red Air is flown.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, in the very beginning of any, whether it's the Top Gun course or whether it be Air Wing Fallon or the Strike Fighter Advanced Readiness Program, the very first few sorties are going to be very benign, where you've got an adversary or a threat that is not proficient and it's going to be kind of should be like a clubbing a baby seal for the fighters,
Which, right, is probably effectively what we've seen for the last 20 years
Right.
in our mainly air-to-ground focus
Right.
on the former War on Terror, whatever
Yeah.
they're calling it now. But as we pivot to Asia, or whatever the buzzword or expression is for now, there are some countries out there with some very formidable threats, and not only the aircraft, but the training and the proficiency and all that. So we need to be on our game.
Yeah.
So let's talk about the Top Gun Adversary course. So let's start at the beginning. How did you apply, or were you an applicant, or did someone come to you and say, hey, we'd like you to come, or how does that part of it work?
Well, when you're in an adversary squadron, they pick and choose who from that squadron is going to go through the adversary course. The idea being, if you're not a blue patch wearer or just like the patch that you wear as a fighter and already an SFTI, because we had a lot of people come to the squadron that were from the weapons school or from the Top Gun staff. If you weren't already a patch wearer, they had billets so you could go through the course as an adversary. So when I joined, I went through a 1-year training, or when I joined my squadron full time, I went through a 1-year training in-house syllabus to be trained up in BFM and to be a adversary wingman. And then once I finished that, then they sent me to Top Gun to go through the adversary course. Like I alluded to earlier, it starts off the same with the BFM phase, and then you work into the 2-ship and 4-ship as Red Air, and it culminates with a large exercise where basically all the adversaries are going against all the fighters all at once, and they throw up a bunch of planes, and it's really more or less for fun. You usually have family in town right before the patching, and they can watch it on the big screen. But when you finish that as an adversary, you become what they call a level 4 adversary instructor now, which meant that I would go back to the squadron, and I'd be the person that would be training all the other guys, all the other patch wearers included, on what the latest tactics are for our threat replications.
Okay. Now, VFA 204 at the time
Yep.
was flying the F-18. I think it's now VFC 204,
It
and
is,
they're flying
yeah.
F-5s. But you went through in the F-18. What did you go to Top Gun and fly?
I flew, so our squadron provided 2 jets.
But the F-18s,
F-18.
right? But
yep.
wasn't that what your blue, like again, if you and I were there at the same time,
Yeah.
I would be flying an F-18.
Right.
Okay. How does that work?
Yeah, they just said, hey, for this mission, you're going to be replicating this type of platform, which meant that I might be mil limited. I couldn't go afterburner. It meant that I had to use my radar a certain way. It meant that I couldn't pull more than X number of Gs. So I would have to, each sortie, I would have to fly based on the exact threat I was replicating for that sortie. But I jumped in. It was NSOC at the time. Now it's Nautic. I would jump in their jets. So it didn't really matter. A through D model, I think I flew. Flew all of them during the class, which is which is funny. I'm sure you know this, but the A model, not the A plus, because we had the A plus at 204 when I went through. When I retired, we were flying the C model, but the A model, it didn't have AIM 120 capability, and so when you would try to select AIM 120 with the weapon select switch, the switch wouldn't move. And there were several times where I was flying a NSOC A, and I was like, "Why is it not moving? I can't select AIM 120." Yeah. But otherwise, they're the same. We just fly them differently.
Yeah. But you make a great point, which is, right, an FA-18 is capable of so much. And maybe if you're simulating a MiG-23, well, it might go faster than an F-18. So your handcuffs, if you will, for that day might be as fast as you can go.
Right.
But a MiG-23 can't pull as many Gs.
Correct.
So you might get 7 Gs for the first 90 degrees of turn.
Correct.
And then you're allowed to, like, maybe, I don't know, 10% of your speed or something.
Yeah.
But that's the point that I was getting from you at the beginning, and you did a good job explaining, is that's why there's professional adversaries. Because if you just go out and fly the F-18, then me on the blue side might not get as good a training, versus if I see you really arcing, which we'd call if it didn't pull good Gs,
right,
then I might have to do a different, not have to, but I might choose to do a different maneuver in order to shoot you in the within visual range, which would be different than if you were just a full-up F-18.
Right, so, absolutely, yeah. Which is the cool thing about having different platforms doing the adversary role. You know, I think the Navy adversary has shrunk considerably. I mean, back in the 80s, it was a lot different. I mean, Air Force included. The Air Force, if you remember, they declassified this program, Constant Peg, that was at Tonopah, and they were flying MiG-17s, MiG-19s, MiG-23s, and Air Force pilots were going to fly against actual MiGs, right? That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
Well, we don't have that today. But at the time, the Navy, there were adversary squadrons in Virginia Beach flying the Kafir. They were flying A4s, all different types of platforms. And now we got to the point where it was just F5 and F-18. That was it. Like you said, 204, VFA 204 is now VFC 204 flying the F5. And you would think, well, that, you know, you're going from the F-18 to the F5, that's kind of a step back. But VFC 13 and Fallon stepped up to the F-16. Yeah. And I've fought against a lot of F-16s in the fleet, Air Force F-16s, and I'm a humble person by nature, but I will say I've crushed every single one of them that I fought against. But I went through the course, and I fought a Top Gun instructor flying an F-16 who fought it totally different, and I got crushed. So it's really good to see different platforms and how they perform, whether it be flown by a pilot, you know, differently, or whether it be because they're replicating a different threat aircraft. That difference is what we need to see more of, I think. Yeah.
No, I agree. And right now, I think the Navy and Marine Corps is limited to, like you said, the F-16 and the F-5, as well as the F-18. Yeah. And once in a while, like VFC 12, they'll paint their jets, their Hornets, Super Hornets now, a different color with some camouflage, or try to make them look like maybe a Russian or a Chinese aircraft. Right. Just so at least in the visual arena, it looks a little different, maybe. But otherwise, yeah, like you said, if you fly it a certain way, then it's an F-18. It's an F-18. But yeah, I had a chance to fly the F-16 at the end of my career, and one thing that it could do that the Hornet couldn't is go fast quickly. Oh yeah. And I remember one particular flight I was doing Mach 1.93. Yeah. And I ate up the entire Fallon Range training complex before I knew it. I was on the other side, and of course, when things happen that quickly, you know, the blue fighters aren't used to that. Right. They only train against F-5s or F-18s, so everything happens really fast. Yeah. And so that's a real eye-opener for them.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
But to your point, I think the Air Force is starting to have some F-35
they are
aggressors, I guess, in there. But I think they're early production, so they weren't really combat capable anyway. Right. They've got F-16s. I think they have some F-15
I think aggressors. So, yeah. Yeah, I mean, the whole landscape is changing now in the aggressors in the Air Force and the adversary of the Navy. And I know that the Navy is viewing the F-5, at least at VFC 204, they're viewing it as a stopgap because of the strike fighter shortfall, where they're waiting for the F-35 to come online. What they're going to get in the future, whether it be a high-lot Super Hornet or a low-lot F-35, I don't know. That remains to be seen. Yeah. But yeah, it has to change.
Yeah. Give me an example of, no kidding, what you might do as a red lead at a Top Gun. Let's say it's the division phase, or maybe a couple weeks from graduation, and so let's just give a scenario here. So I'm going to lead the division, so 4 F-18s, okay, and I'm going to come in and pick a fight in your country. Yep. So you're on a DCA, defensive counter-air, and I'm on OCA. Now, I, as part of my syllabus, might have certain things I want to train
Correct.
to. And we'll keep it simple. So let's rule out like electronic attack or anything like that. But if you're just looking to defend the motherland from the Yankee imperialists like me, give me an idea of what sort of presentation you might come up with.
Yeah. So that's a very standard one, right? And what they would usually do for these scenarios, they would designate certain places that were airfields, enemy airfields. Usually one of them is Fallon, and we'll usually keep Red Air on the ground, no kidding, on the ground to be a strip alert. So maybe once you cross a certain line, I'm going to go ahead and launch those guys, and they're going to run you down, right? So you're looking at your radar and you're not seeing those guys because they're actually on the ground. So we would have other people that are capping at the other locations, doing a kind of a defensive patrol where they're flowing into the threat sector and then flowing cold, and they're waiting for you to trip a desired commit line, right? And then a lot of times we would use the F5s to do what we called a coastal patrol, where they might simulate flying up and down a coast, low altitude, and it's testing a few things. For one, the fighters looking to make sure they're sanitizing low and looking for those aircraft that might be down in the weeds, and also a visual lookout, because we might send one F5 to follow the fighters out to cap uncalled, and then he would sneak into their formations to make sure they're still looking outside the canopy and looking for a threat out there. And if they called it, we'd terminate that guy and say, okay, training objective met, and then we'd look to make sure that they would target the coastal patrol guys. And then once you come past the desired commit line and you reach maybe 10 miles from feet dry, then we would start sending guys from the caps out to challenge you, look to have you split apart your forces, see if we can maybe overload one sector over another, maybe put a lot of guys on one side of the formation and not so many on the other, to see how you handle it. Everything like you said, everything is based on your training objectives. Whatever your training objectives are, we want to meet those. But we want to give you a challenging presentation, something that's going to make you think on the fly, something that's going to make you adapt to the evolving situation. But everything is definitely, it's winnable, right? You're never going to be put in a no-win situation. So usually we would fly what we would call double cycle. So we would do Red Air for one wave of fighters, reach the logical conclusion of that. Once the training objectives have been met, then those fighters would go home, another set of fighters would come out, and then we would set up and do the exact same thing.
And you talked about having strip alerts, as you could put it, in Fallon. Now, everybody's originating from Fallon, so just to make the point for the listeners and viewers, the blue forces might take off first, go all the way out, 120 miles east, set up out by the Ruby Mountains or whatever it is out there, and then when everybody's ready and we have all the protocols for, okay, fighter set, bandit set, here we go, then the fight is on, like you said, and then you knock it off. And the blue, generally speaking, runs out of gas first because they're using that left hand.
Correct.
They want to get the best training, not necessarily save gas.
Right.
So the bandits may or may not do that.
Yeah.
And so you can have a couple waves there. Yeah. But the other thing is, right, if the scenario was reversed and I was doing a DCA, let's say I'm protecting my carrier, and now you're coming to attack me, you as the red lead are going to change the scenario. In other words, the wild card, as you put it, right? You didn't use that term, but the guy who's kind of in the fox in the hen house, you're not going to do that on a DCA, because how would that guy get out there and jump in over my carrier? Yeah. So it really, again, is scenario based.
Yes, absolutely. It's definitely scenario based.
Yeah. And then there are some, shall I say, training limitations with Fallon. Now, it's roughly, the valleys are like 4,000 feet. The peaks are, I think, up to 8 or 9 or maybe even 10. It's been a while. Yeah. But we're talking about a coastal patrol, quote unquote, but now we've got all these mountains. So there are some limitations.
There are.
But we do our best. And we also have, we didn't talk about it yet, but RTOs, right? Range training officers. Yep. And those are folks that are watching this instrumented range and providing safety oversight. Right.
And that's what those, like I mentioned, the controllers that would go through the class, they would be watching that. Instead of an actual radar feed, they'd be watching the tax displays and giving control based on that. using standard TOPGUN, comm.
Yeah. But while Fallon is sort of the place where we all get trained, particularly as adversaries, it's not where you always operate now. Like you said earlier, you might go there and help with an air wing, or go to San Diego and help with a COM2X or whatever. But you might also do missions in other places. And so part of your job as Red Air, correct me if I'm wrong, is to kind of ensure the training goes well as far as we don't spill out, because you and the next day could be right next to that training airspace in your airline capacity, and you don't want to have a close call. And so part of that is sort of owning, right, the training rules.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Especially when it's what we call reverse AIC. So if we don't have a designated controller that's, like you said, an RTO, somebody that's in the tax building watching the fight live and controlling it, but you have the adversary that's providing reverse control. So using my onboard sensors to say where I'm located and what I'm doing to provide the fighter that situational awareness, then it's really incumbent upon me to set the war, set the training rules, and I mean, technically the fighter sets it, but we make all the recommendations.
Right. So, all right. So, again, I know this, but for the sake of those who might be unfamiliar. So, you are, let's say, flying as the red lead against me, let's say, on the East Coast. You are not only coming up with a plan, managing the airspace, giving me the recommendations, and now managing your presentation to give me the best training, but you're also playing AWACS or E2
Correct.
Hawkeye and giving me the control that I might expect to hear?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
So I'm trying to build a picture here for why we do, in fact, need professional adversaries, because that's not easy, because you're doing it backwards.
Yeah, it's gotten a little bit easier with, if you had mids or a data link, in which we did have in the F-18C in the later days of the Hornet at 204. That was a really good tool to use. Because then you could, on your displays, see where everyone's located. You could put your cursors over a guy. You could get the bullseye cut from him. Mm-hmm. So your comm was very tight. They also went to what they call Red Link or RedNet. They call it RedNet.
Okay.
And there are these tablets that basically tap into the tax pods. And it's essentially the same thing. It's a God's eye view of the fight, and you could color each symbol with the call sign, so you knew who was who, and that was really useful. That's what they're using now in the F5s. And I think the newer F5s, TAC Air is modifying some for the Navy. I think it's all integrated into their aircraft instead of it being an actual tablet that we're carrying on our knee. But it's gotten a little bit easier. But yeah, early on when I was flying the A+, it was complete just Jedi, like in my head, knowing where everyone was, and providing that comm.
Yeah. Well, part of those F5s are owned and upgraded by Bones, who sat in that seat.
Yeah.
Owns this Circle Air Group FBO, where our studio is located, and they've got some sort of Garmin, I guess, super suite that just makes these things ultra nice.
Yeah.
Definitely nicer than our airlines, at least. I don't know what you fly.
Right.
My 7.5 is pretty antiquated.
Yeah.
But I'm glad you mentioned that, because increasingly there are more and more civilian companies providing radar. Tell me about that. I mean, how do they do that, and how good are they? And
I will say, how good are they? Number one, I'd say they're very good, right? Because almost all of them are former Air Force, Navy, Marine Corps, Adversary, Aggressor pilots. So they have a ton of experience. Yeah. They were flying it professionally as active duty pilots, and then now they're doing it professionally as contractors. So they are very, very good at what they do, and that's all they do.
Yeah.
So that's number one. I've flown with them in Guam. I've flown with them off the coast of Hawaii, off the coast of California, on the East Coast, in Fallon, everywhere you can think of, flying Kafirs, Hawker Hunters, A4s, just a myriad of platforms, and they're all quite good. Yeah. The nice thing is you will always have an active duty or reserve adversary pilot who is the overall lead. So me as a VFA 204, now VFC 204 pilot, I might be designated the red lead for an event. I will brief everybody on what their roles are, including some of those contractors and the ATAC or TAC Air or whoever else. I'll brief them on what their roles are, and they fill in and they provide it quite well.
Okay. So in other words, if I and my 3 buddies are in the alley and I meet you and you've got your group of thugs behind you, you're kind of leading them and they're all helping you as we do our thing and have our street fight there.
Yeah, I might send them out to be, the high fast flyer, right? So they're gonna go real fast. I think there was a limitation that you weren't allowed to they weren't allowed to engage like in the visual arena. And so we'd probably primarily use them for BVR, or beyond visual range engagements, or high fast flyer, and then have them cut out, or there might be a striker that gets killed, something like that.
Well, and I think it's getting more popular because it allows the military to basically say, hey, we don't want to man, train, and equip necessarily all these adversary squadrons because we don't get a lot of return when it comes time to go off to war directly. In other words, we get it because that unit trains this unit, but that unit isn't useful to me. And so instead, like is pretty common, I guess, in the government, is we'll just contract it out. Hey, this is how much money we have to spend. If you can meet that and give us this many sorties in these locations, then great. We need this kind of aircraft, or at least maybe capability. We need this many flights. And so there's more and more squadron or companies that are doing that.
And there's pluses and minuses to it. My first deployment when I was with VFA 87, I actually cruised with VFA 201. They were for all intents and purposes, an adversary squadron. They were my red air for my 106 fighter jet down in Key West, so I knew a lot of those guys as a new Hornet pilot. I fought them in Key West, and they when OIF kicked off Operation Iraqi Freedom in 2003, we needed another Hornet squadron, and so the Navy Reserve ponied up 201, and they joined us. And so their blue tactics might have been rusty. They might not have flown from the other end of the fight in years, but they dusted off that real quick. There was a ton of experience. I mean, you just can't discount the fact that those guys have been doing nothing but BFM, every day, for years. They knew how to fly that airplane. So stepping them into the blue world was challenging at first, but then they got on speed real quick. And it was pretty awesome. I flew several combat sorties with as a wingman for them, and a lot of them were airline pilots, and I just got to see a different side of things. But so I think the Navy's being a little short-sighted in saying that that adversary squadrons don't buy them anything in the real world. I think they do. They just don't want to put that much money into a squadron only to use it once every 30 or 40 years on deployment,
Well, and to be fair, those are my words, not the Navy's, but I do recall discussions about that. Because it's just not as pay this, get that. It's pay this later on, get something else for it. And it's just, I guess, hard. I don't know. I've not walked in these circles, but to either convince Congress or taxpayers or whoever is holding the purse strings or cares that, we need this capability because for all the reasons we've just discussed over the last many minutes is it makes, right? Again, I've been kind of using the two of us, but if you're doing your job well, I, as a blue guy, should be able to go out and do my real world tactics well.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Good stuff. I did hear about when 201 went out. Apparently they were a lot of fun to have out there because they're, like you said, very experienced, very senior, did well behind the boat for the most part, and had some good ready room and Liberty antics as well.
Oh yes, I mean, as a young lieutenant junior grade, it was an eye-opening experience for me seeing those guys, and I got to fly with a lot of them at 204 later on, So
and they were really senior, right? Like a bunch of commanders and lieutenant commanders, and only a handful of lieutenants.
And I don't remember there being any lieutenants. In fact, I remember there was one lieutenant, and I won't say his name, but we were in Fallon. The Secretary of the Navy came, and this lieutenant stood up and said, sir, my promotion package is sitting on your desk right now, and it's really important for me to get promoted because I don't want to be a boato. Because as a lieutenant, you would be a boat officer where you'd have to ride the Liberty boats, from the carrier to shore in port. And he said, I want to be a lieutenant commander. So he ended up not going on that deployment, by the way, but.
Related to that?
I think it might be.
Attitude in general?
I think it might be. I don't know his attitude in general. But.
Oh, boy. All right. Well, Farley, this is fun, and I've got a bunch of listener questions here I want to throw at you.
Yeah, absolutely.
So let's move into that phase of it. Some of it we've already talked about, but these are from folks that support me in the Fighter Pilot Podcast on a website called Patreon.
Great.
So at any rate, they know I'm going to sit down with you, and they get to pose questions. So the first one is from Derek Burney, who says, do you find that it is important to fly a dissimilar aircraft as an adversary? We already know you did not, arguably. Another way to put it is, do you find it more difficult to train if you are flying the same aircraft type as the Top Gun students you are training?
Yeah, we did touch on that a little bit, but the one thing that I will say, and I agree with the premise of the question, which is that it's important to have dissimilar training at some point in the students' training because as a Hornet pilot, if I look across the circle and I see another Hornet there, and maybe we're approaching a merge and I see his nose cocked up, I might know he's bled down because I know what that looks like. Or I might see the vapes coming off the wing and I know he's really struggling, maybe digging in. But you might not see the exact same cues that you were used to seeing if it was a F-16 or if it was an F-5 or Kafir or something like that. So I do think it's important to have dissimilar training. I don't think flying the same platform is a detriment. I think you still can fly it in a way where the training objectives are met, but it just, like you said, requires a professional adversary to do it.
So Top Gun, through its history, right, has flown BFM in F4, well, F4s too, but I'm talking about for the red side, the instructor side, A4s, F5s. And until the instructors started having their blue quals, if you will, while on the staff, it was always dissimilar. And I remember when I was on the staff in 2000, one of the points they would make was, Jello, if you and I are both in an F-18 equal airplane, and we go out and I kick your butt as a Top Gun instructor, and let's say I'm a student or a fleet guy, like, what does that tell you? Like, that's actually a really good point, because now it makes the case of it's not necessarily the airplane, as we all learned from Top Gun Maverick and everything else, it's the pilot. And so if you can take two basically equal airplanes, start neutral, and then at the end, one's behind the other and consistently, well, then that tells that student you have something to learn.
Right.
And the Top Gun instructor can hopefully teach you.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, same thing for an adversary instructor. All right. Joe Kunzler says, do adversary pilots study just the Russians and Chinese or ... You also threw in North Korea there, but right? A lot of countries around the world fly aircraft. Some of them we're very chummy with. Right. Some of them we're not so getting along with. And there's a lot in the middle. So how do we decide who, quote unquote, is a threat?
Yeah. I don't get to decide who's a threat. There's definitely somebody well above my pay grade who decides. But basically, we look at the intelligence and we look at where we're most likely to run into some shooting war or some encounter. For most of my career, the Chinese invasion of Taiwan was a big stressor.
A possibility.
A big possibility. It still is. And so that was what a lot of what we trained to was, former Soviet Union tactics that have evolved to Chinese. And to be completely honest, China has watched how we train our pilots, and they are emulating it. They now have something similar to red flag. They have flankers that are painted like F-15s, just like we paint ours like flankers, Right. And so they're upping their game, and every year, usually it's around tailhook in Reno. They do a re-red or a re-blue where patch wearers could go back and get the latest and greatest on what the tactics are. And as an adversary, we would go back and get the latest and greatest on what threats we're looking at. For a while, I know Iran was on that list, which I always like to joke with the former Tomcat guys that Tomcat's nothing but a target now because the only country he still has them is possible enemy. But yeah, it changes, but we're always looking at what the actual threats are to our country.
I'm told that in China they call themselves red air, like we call ourselves blue air, and their quote unquote adversaries are the blue air. So but when I went through Top Gun, our threat pilot and tactic instructor Crusoe was his call sign, Crew, he had a picture of a Chinese high-ranking guy that had come to Fallon. I guess at some point we thought it'd be okay to let them come over and see what we're doing. And so, but part of his discussion was they're watching what we're doing and trying to do better. And they've really upped their game in the 20 years since I went to Top Gun because they've gotten away from those very scripted, as you said, former Soviet Union tactics, which we knew pretty well. And the fighter pilot wasn't given a lot of leeway to make his or her own decisions like we do in the West. And so we always thought of that as a limitation. And so as countries get away from that, it's going to make it more challenging for us to continue to hold the advantage.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, cool. All right, Matt McDonough. Does the current fleet of adversary aircraft adequately reflect/mimic modern threats? And is there a money is no object option in the current inventory that would make a truly ideal adversary aircraft?
I mean, in a perfect world, you would want to actually fly what your adversaries are flying. So like I mentioned constant peg earlier, where we were flying, Russian-made, Chinese-made fighters. That would be perfect. And I know that there have been some companies that have tried acquiring MiG-29s or Su-27s and try to use those in adversary capacity. It's never really come to fruition, but that's what I would love.
Yeah.
I would love to get in one of those and fly it like to the maximum of my capability. But I really do think that we need to move away from the F5. We need to move away from a platform that and all the F5 guys are going to hate me for this because most of them love the plane, and I'm sure it's a great plane to fly.
Yeah.
But we need more capabilities. I did red air against the F-35 in my last couple of years at 204, and I can't see them. It's stealth, right? You're not supposed to see them.
Right.
And I didn't have all the tools that maybe some of the newer platforms have available to me to maybe give a good presentation, to maybe actually replicate a 5th generation Chinese fighter or Russian fighter. Yeah. So I would like to see something more maybe a high lot Super Hornet or F-35, for Navy adversary. But yeah, he also hinted at it comes down to dollars and cents.
Yeah.
Sometimes Congress doesn't have the dollars or the cents to fund it. So,
how are you spelling sense in that sentence?
I'll let you decide.
That's right. I still think an F-16 is a fantastic adversary. Yeah. It's a little small compared to a flanker, but it's so capable and so prolific that there's parts, there's money, there's know-how. And so I think that does make a great adversary. It's certainly better. I'm with you. I've had a lot of friends that love the F5, but let's face it, it's short-legged. It just, with the exception of some of the stuff they're putting on it now, has never had the systems and avionics that it's always needed. And even with all that, you get it in the phone booth, as we like to call a dogfight, and it's still an F5.
Right.
So, of course, if you go back in time, that's why they had the idea for the F-20. But at any rate, I still think an F-16 is a great adversary. But to your point, if it penciled out, and I guess it never did as far as a business plan goes, buy a bunch of those Moldovan MiG-29s rather, or get some Su-27s and make it work. But I guess those are difficult because parts are different on every airplane and they're expensive, and we're not making them here in the West, so you got to figure out a way to get all those parts.
Right.
So, all right, Nick Forster. Do you retain your Blue Air qualifications, or because you don't get to train to them often enough, are they mothballed until you return to a fleet squadron? So you talked a little bit about 201, but talk about that, like maybe for you after you went to Top Gun as a 204 pilot.
Yeah, so that's a great question. There was a time in the reserves where the reserves actually had a reserve air wing. So it had E-2 Prowler, F-14s, F-18s, and the idea was you could take that air wing and you could stick them on a carrier and they could deploy. And I think VFA 201 was the last squadron to deploy on a carrier in the reserve world. The time before that had, I think, been the Korean War, so it wasn't very common, at least in a combat capacity. VFA 204, when we were still a VFA, still flying Hornets, we retained that strategic reserve piece. So we were that deployable squadron. Now, did we train to our blue tactics? Not as much as we should have. However, I will say, as an adversary, you're looking at it from the other side, but it's the same thing. So I again, as an adversary, I know what the fighters are going to do, and I build my presentation around that. So I'm inadvertently training myself because I know when maybe a fighter's late on timeline, and I can see that from the other side. So we were very proficient in blue tactics, air-to-air wise. We did go bomb. We did do a lot of close air support working with JTACs, and we retained those qualifications. We did go to the carrier and do carrier qualifications, but then, as it progressed later and later in my career, those opportunities became fewer and far between until finally the Navy said, no more. you're only going to do red air. You're only doing adversary, and that's when we were kind of leading up to becoming a VFC or flying the F5.
Yeah. I remember even as a young F-18 pilot being somewhat overwhelmed by just the number of missions we had to do, both fighter and attack, and then all the special weapons, Harpoon, Harm, Maverick, all these different things. Yeah. And so to add red on top of that would have already been difficult. But then, right, in the early 2000s, our blue tactics had a huge makeover, courtesy of a friend of mine, actually, I was in flight school with and at Top Gun with. He went back and was part of that. And so for me, as I got more senior and more pulled in different directions, I found it hard to keep up with all those blue tactics because they were changing and they were so much more dynamic. So yeah, I can only imagine if your bread and butter is red and, oh, by the way, we're supposed to still be obliged to this other thing, that could be very challenging to do.
Yeah.
But like you said, seeing it from the other side, almost like being an LSO, kind of almost makes you a better ball flyer. Maybe.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, all right, cool. I think we answered Anthony Lombardo's question. Is the adversary role best left to the military, or is it a role that can be outsourced more to private enterprise? We've talked about both sides of that coin in a sense.
Yeah.
All right, let's move on to Michael Braun. How will UASs, which is unmanned aerial systems, change how adversaries and aggressors train our fighting forces? But before you even answer Michael's question, are UASs being used as adversaries and aggressors?
No, we are not using them. We have done some exercises with them, but usually those are in conjunction with air-to-ground missions. I'm trying to think. We would have Predators or Reapers in the stack when we were doing close air support. But in an adversary role, we haven't. I could see that being a possibility, but I think a more likely scenario is what we're seeing more of now. I can't remember what they call it, but it's basically a virtual adversary where you put an adversary pilot in a simulator that is then he's basically flying in a virtual world, and his location is basically being sent digitally via data link to the fighters. Yeah. And so they might see something on their radar or in their systems that isn't actually there. Yeah. And so I think we're going to see that more and more. It's a cost savings thing. It's obviously cheaper to get into a simulator than it is to get into a multi-million-dollar jet and dump fuel into the exhaust. But yeah, I don't know that UASs are probably going to be used in a better capacity. Now, how are we simulating UASs possibly? Because I know there have been instances in Syria where you've got Russians that are intercepting our drones and dumping fuel on them and things like that. So maybe we will do that. Maybe we will simulate UASs. I know we've simulated cruise missiles. We've simulated commercial aircraft. And all you are is just a dot on the radar at that point.
Yeah. When I was at the weapons school, we were doing SFARPs, as you talked about earlier, and one of our missions was armed reconnaissance, where the fighters are out looking for, folks doing maybe what they shouldn't be on the ground. And at the time, I was back flying the T-34C Turbo Mentor, and so we were a manned aircraft simulating a UAS, which I always made my eyes cross. But the point was, in that scenario, they're kind of looking around, let's say Iraq or Afghanistan, is there's going to be a lot of those drones you mentioned earlier that might be there. And so we were communicating with the fighters, pretending we were UASs. It was it was weird, but yeah. And then I think the other thing you're talking about is the live virtual construct paradigm. We've had Cubic on the show many times. We're good friends with PK and all them. And that's a big deal for them because you sort of, if you don't mind me calling you out, you sort of trivialize it as just being good for the cost, but it also definitely helps with the numbers that we can see as well as the size of the range, right? Because when you and I are flying up and down the different sides of the Fallon Range Training Complex, well, if they really need a certain scenario, we're going to be off somewhere else or conflicted if there's not maybe just a virtual guy there.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right, because with the F-35 and the tactics they're using, it requires a much greater range than we've historically used. So honestly, the Fallon Range Training Complex is not big enough. I know that's one of their big things they're trying to do is acquire more range space. We've gone off the coast of California, and again, you're even over the ocean, you're still constrained by jetways and commercial traffic, and so it is hard to find range space where you can get those effective ranges. So yeah, that's a good point.
Yep. All right. Jevin wants to know, we've heard about pilots on the Grad 1v1 arriving at the merge with a weapons loadout of 1 bullet. Now, I don't know where Jevin's getting that. I remember guns only, but 1 bullet. Yeah. Anyway, what other, quote, no-win scenarios do you throw at your trainees during the syllabus? And you've already touched on this. And why is this important? And I love the genesis of Jevin's question, because it almost has not a nefarious element to it, but I almost didn't ask it because it's sort of exact opposite of what we try to do, and you've already painted that. But I bring it up just to make the point again: is it's not just Farley versus Jello, and may the best man win. It's really about the training. So I'm kind of, I don't know where I'm going with all that, but I don't know. What would you say to Jevin here?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree that we're not looking for no-win scenarios, right? We want there to be an actual training objective. Now, the Grad 1v1 is all about fun. Let's just be honest. You have guys come from all over the country in A-10s, F-15s, F-16s, F-35s. I brought T-45s up. I was going to tell you that. And the cool thing is, as a student, you go to a merge, you don't know what you're going to encounter. And that's the greatest part about the training, is you've learned how to adapt your game plan based on what you go to the merge with. So you may be expecting to come to merge with an F-16, and you've got one game plan in your head, and then, oh, look, it's T-45, and it's not just one, it's 2. He's got 2. What am I going to do? And you immediately have to adapt to it. So that's the fun part about 1v1. And obviously we're making fun of each other on the radio, beforehand, afterwards. I know, I don't know if you've mentioned this before, but if you lose that fight, you have to shoot the high TACAN into Fallon and call final approach fix on the base radio. And so everyone's in the bar, looking up going, oh man,
there's somebody with his gear down from 5 miles out.
Right.
I don't think anyone really does that, though.
Yeah. We had a Raptor guy do it when a girl in my class beat him. So that was kind of cool.
Yeah, good. Well, and the point you're making is the Grad 1v1 is an isolated event where it's sort of celebratory. It's towards the end of the syllabus. And it's just like you said, it's a memorable thing. I can remember almost each of mine. I saw a T-45 once when I was in an F-18B with Chili Culpepper in the backseat. I've seen an F-16. I saw a Tornado. I was in F-18s for both of those. And then I've been in an F-16 and met, I forget what I met. But anyway, the point is, it's an interesting experience, and it's very, fun, celebratory. But otherwise, as you stated, there's training objectives we're looking to do, with the exception of, you mentioned it earlier, there's that last sort of big graduation exercise where it's probably not so much training objectives, but just the pure, as I imagined earlier, OCA, DCA. In other words, if I'm coming to get you, you're going to defend your country. Now, never mind that I need to learn high fast flyers or electronic attack or groups in a certain separation from each other. Those are all, hey, I'm going to send you a fastball as part of it. But at the end of the syllabus, now I'm just coming to pick a fight with you. You're trying to defend the motherland, and whatever you want to do works. And I'm going to do whatever I think works for me. And maybe some of those other things that we saw before, we'll see again.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, the grad strike was great fun for that.
Yeah. Was it, though, the opposite, right? Was it the blue was going? Well, no, it was, but they were also attacking.
They were. So in my class, it's funny. My class, we had a blizzard come through, and so we actually never did our grad strike.
Oh, no.
Yeah, I was kind of disappointed by it, but if you go back to the fleet training building now and you look at all the class pictures, there's one with one class huddled underneath the Hornet with snow everywhere. That's my class.
That's you guys?
That's my class, yeah.
All right, fantastic. Our last Patreon listener question is from John Clark. How will the adversaries evolve in training, tactics, and aircraft as the world's air forces move to late Gen 4 and into Gen 5 and 6 technologies?
Yeah, I mean, it's just the way we always have. You look at what the threat countries are doing in terms of their training, their proficiency, how they're employing their weapon systems, and then we're going to just replicate those exactly.
Yeah. And like we said earlier, we already have some Air Force F-35 adversaries, so hopefully we'll have a chance to, like you did as the Red Air, you couldn't see the guy at all, so we'll see how that all plays out. But it's the escalation of arms. It's just going to continue. They do something, we do something, back from swords and shields and armor,
exactly,
arrows and everything else. So here we are. Yeah. Fantastic. Well, so you're not in this business anymore necessarily, but
Right.
from where you were and what you keep an eye on, what do you suppose is the future of Red Air? That's what we're talking about today.
Well, you talked about a live virtual construct. Like I said, I think that is, at least in the immediate future, that is going to be a big thing. In the Navy, on the Navy and Marine Corps side, I do think we're going to see ourselves moving away from the F5 into more, even F-16s, like VFC-13s flying F-16s now, which is a huge win for Red Air and Fallon. I think we'll see more of fourth-gen, fighters stepping into the adversary role. I really have a hard time thinking we're going to shrink any more than we already have. When I joined the Navy, we had VFA 203, VFA 201, and both those squadrons went away. So now we added 111. We added VFC 111 that was a det from VFC 13 down in Key West, and I think we're in a good spot right now where we basically have. On the East Coast, you have an F5 and the fourth-gen Adversary, and now on the West Coast, you've got the F-16s, probably fourth-gen, and then 204 is sort of an outlier down there in New Orleans. But I think we're in a good spot right now. I wish I was behind closed doors sometimes and figuring out, what we're going to do with Adversary of the future, but it's definitely something that's near and dear to my heart, doing it for 13 years,
Yeah, I could tell. Well, and in between all those big rocks, the little rocks are the Drakens, ATACs, TAC Air. I know I'm missing a whole bunch of them, but they're bringing, there's one in Top Bases, I think it is, that's bringing F-16 civilian. Yeah. But, Mirage F-1s, like you said, A-4 Skyhawks, L-39s, Hawker Hunters, all these different aircraft, which if nothing else look different, fly different, but also can be available at a cost to the government, but to be either blips or people who can assess how the fighters are doing. Because in the end, the live virtual construct, the live part of it, there still needs to be a big L, I propose.
Yes, so, absolutely.
Yeah. Cool. Yeah. All right. Well, what about the future for you? I mean, you're out of it, so you're doing the airline gig, which I hope is going well for you. It's not going as well for me right now, as you can tell, but I'm hopefully going to get back to it. But you're going to just keep doing that till you hit the whatever age it is. It's 65 right now. I guess they might. Yeah. Trying to bump it to 67. But.
Yeah. As of right now, yes. Okay. I upgraded to the left seat in my airline earlier this year. So being a captain is great. Yeah. I'm really enjoying it. We're in negotiations. I'm trying not to let any of that bring me down. But yeah, the airline job is really good. Like I said earlier, I spend all my time now, all my free time writing books. And this I got into the book writing thing pretty much around COVID time frame. I took some time off from the airline, and I spent a lot of time in the Navy doing adversary stuff. And I just had a lot of time in hotel rooms. And I was like, you know what, I'm gonna write a book. So, and I'd had one in me for a while, I've been working on it for years. So I finally finished it, and I'm going to try to sell it. So started, looked up online, how do I sell a book? Mm-hmm. You need an agent. Okay. So I go look for an agent. I won't bore you with all the details, but it basically took me 2 years to finally land my agent. And he was my dream agent. He's a fantastic guy, represents some of the biggest names in the business, at least for my genre.
If you want to give him a shout out.
John Talbot. I mean, he is an amazing agent, and so he took my I wrote a book that I sent him, and he said, this is fantastic, but it took place in Africa. He said, no one wants to read about Africa. Can it take place in the U.S.? And I said, oh, not really. I can't hunt al-Shabaab terrorists in the United States. He's like, well, let me see what else you've written. And I had just started writing this book, which ended up becoming Unknown Writer. And I'd written, I think, 2 or 3 chapters, and I sent him those. And he says, this is it. When can you have this one done? So I finished it, sent it to him. He had me rewrite it again. And then we went out to sell it, sold it in a 4-book deal to Seven River Publishing. And they really wanted, and kudos to Severn River, they really wanted to have carrier aviation and naval aviation be the focus of my books. And so that's what, if you read my books, that's what I hope to convey is like what it's like being a Navy pilot. Yeah. There's obviously espionage involved. There's, China is a big threat in my book. but I really want the reader to walk away knowing what it's like to be on a carrier or landing on a carrier at night or flying missions off the boat and just wanted that experience for my readers.
Yeah. Well, you sent me Unknown Rider several months ago. I do, True Confessions, get a lot of books, and so I put them in an order of I don't know what. But I looked at that one and I said, oh, it's got an F-35 on the cover. I guess I can start on this one. And it before I knew it, I was done because it was a page turner. And I have to tell you this, Farley. I just thought that maybe you were secretly spying on me because there's parts of it in San Diego, which is where I live, and Balboa Park and Kearney Mesa or whatever. I'm like, oh yeah, I can like picture all of it. Yeah. And then there's part up in like San Luis Obispo, Pismo Beach. I grew up there.
Yeah.
And so then you're talking about San Clemente, where I've flown over a dozen times, and it was just weird.
Yeah, yeah.
Now the one part for me that I didn't know real well was the F-35, and I don't want to give too much away, but I really enjoyed it because it was believable, and I have 5 deployments, and I don't know that much about the F-35, but it doesn't need to be true to be fun, right? And so, like I said, I won't talk about what happens, but that part of it I think will make people wonder, wait a minute, can that really happen? And that's what makes a book fun. And so I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, like you alluded to, the premise is that the Chinese figured out how to hack into the F-35.
I'll let you give it away. I didn't. Want to give it away.
And that's. I mean, that's not going to be a huge shock to anybody. I mean, it was a concern back in 2017, and there's been some concerns. And of course, we had that Marine F-35 that went missing not too long ago, and there was a lot of people on the Twitter sphere. We're talking about what happened.
It's still flying out on
its
way.
Exactly.
Right now.
Yeah, some China landed at some airstrip somewhere. Right. So, and at Tailhook, I ran into one of my former skippers who works for Lockheed Martin, and I was telling him about the book, and he goes, like they thought about this stuff, right? I mean, it's a concern when you put a jet that is so advanced that it's connected to the outside world in so many ways. You're just opening it up to vulnerabilities. So everything in it is completely fictional. I have no knowledge whatsoever. I'll just say this right now. No knowledge whatsoever this is possible. But I think it's within the realm of possibility. And I did have he was a Marine F-35 pilot. Was the first guy to go through Top Gun in the F-35. He read it and what I wanted him to read it for was so that people could go, okay, yeah, this reads like somebody that knows what they're talking about. But like you, I've never flown the F-35, but I've just flown against it.
Yeah. Well, but let's take a step back because I do a little bit of writing, and some days it's easy, some days it's hard. Not everybody can write. I mean, did you have a propensity for writing in school, or did you just say, this is something I want to do, and so I'm going to just try to be good at it?
Yeah, I always, for me, a bookstore or a library is like a toy store. As a kid growing up in the summertime, I would just go to the library. And for me, it was the whole world was at my fingertips, right? And even the universe, because there were books on anything that I wanted to read. Yeah. And so I always spent my time in libraries. I go to a bookstore and still to this day, and I'll just roam the shelves. Oh, that's a good book. We have that. We have that. And so for me, books are something that are near and dear to my heart. I've always wanted to write. I just never really committed myself to it. And like anything, it's an exercise. You have to practice. My first one that I wrote, I'm sure, is trash. The first 5 I wrote are probably trash. This was my 6th book that I actually wrote. The other ones will never see the light of day. But you just learn as you put in the reps. Yeah.
Well, I am 8 chapters and about 52,000 words into my memoirs. So can I consider you a resource?
You absolutely can.
Because I will be looking, I'm sure, at some point for publishing guidance and maybe an agent and all that. So good. Well, appreciate that. Now, is there going to be a sequel, or what else are you working on? I mean, you don't want to give too much away, but not everybody in there dies at the end, like Rogue One. So are we going to see some of those names again?
You are, absolutely. So the main characters in the book, Colt Mother Bancroft, he's a Top Gun instructor. He is the main character, and then I'd say the secondary main character is this NCIS special agent, Emmy Punky King, and both of those continue through the whole series. There's a 4-book series right now. Wow. The second one is titled Outlaw. It comes out in February. So if you get in on this when it comes out in November, the sequels will follow pretty quickly. book 3, I think, will come out in June of next year, and then the 4th one will come out later in 2024. So I'm working on finishing that series up. I do have another series. I can't say much about it right now. Another 3-book series with a different publisher that I'm really excited about. So I'm working on that as well. So also, I have 7 books to my name. That when it's all said and done, will be out there, and hopefully there will be more coming in the future. But you never know.
Fantastic. I probably shouldn't even ask anymore where books can be found, because I think most of them are bought on Amazon, right?
Right.
But do you have a website you want to mention?
JackStewartBooks.com is my website. And if you go there, you can look up the book, and you can actually click on links to get to order it. Like you said, Amazon is a great place. Barnes & Noble, pretty much anywhere books are sold. Yeah. Right now, the paperback, ebook, and audiobook are all available for pre-order. It comes out November 21st. I'm really excited about the audiobook.
Which one? The next one, or Unknown
Rider?
The
Unknown Rider comes out November 21st.
Okay. Oh, yeah. I got an advance copy of that.
Yes, you got an advance copy.
All right.
So right now it's just pre-order.
Gotcha.
But I just want to throw a shout out. The audiobook narrator is Ray Porter, which if anybody has read any of Jack Carr's books, like The Terminal List, he's the narrator for those, and he is fantastic. I mean, when I found out he was going to narrate my books, I was over the moon excited. So if you're an audiobook listener, consider purchasing that.
There you go. Fantastic. Well, keep us informed as books come, and we'll throw them on our website and help promote them. You've been a guest now on the Fighter Pilot podcast, so we want to help you get where you're going with that. And like you said, I didn't address it earlier, but right, you get on a layover somewhere, Orlando.
Yeah.
What can you do? You can go to the bar, you can go to the gym, you can turn on the TV.
Right.
Well, you can only do so much of any of those, in my opinion.
Yeah.
And so having a project like a book, in my case a podcast, but also my memoirs, is good, because you can be effective, and it gives you
not waste your time. Yeah, absolutely.
Fantastic. Awesome.
Yeah.
All right. Well, just kind of circling back real quick to the adversary talk that we had. Anything I didn't ask you that maybe I should, as far as whether it's the Top Gun course or anything else with your experiences? I think we covered it pretty well.
No, yeah, I think we did. I really appreciate you giving me the opportunity to talk about the adversary mission in particular.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of guys out there still doing it, and they're going to critique everything I said when they listen to this podcast. But that's okay, because they're doing God's work out there.
Yeah. Well, this is your experience and interpretation of it. Yeah. And if they have a different one, well, then give me a call and you can come on and talk about it. And we should probably, I tried not to ask you too much about the Air Force side of things, because we could probably find one of those guys or gals, and they might do it slightly different.
Absolutely.
So, but cool. Well, I can't let you go before asking you how someone came up with Farley for Jack Stewart.
Yeah. Oh, man, that's... everyone asks that question, and I usually say it's going to take a whiskey or two to get me to tell that story, but I appreciate you having me on, so I'm going to go ahead and tell the story.
All right.
So when I joined VF 87, I was the first new guy that they had since returning home from Afghanistan. They were on the Enterprise when 9/11 happened, and so they were on their way home, and the carrier turned around. So they were some of the first guys that dropped bombs in Afghanistan after 9/11, and so I joined the squadron. They're all combat seasoned aviators. And I came with the call sign Martha because my name's Stewart, so people would name me Martha Stewart. And they're like, we can't have a guy named Martha in this squadron. So they were going to change my call sign to something. Didn't know what it was. Well, as a new guy, they gave me an opportunity to brief the entire squadron on some system on the Hornet.
Right.
So I remember standing up in the ready room, and everyone's sitting around the table looking at me, and then they started talking to each other, and I started giving the brief and realized no one was listening to a word I was saying. And so I sort of trailed off and stopped talking. And somebody goes, did I hear a Niner in there? Like Tommy Boy. And started, so they're like, oh, they started calling me Tommy Boy, and that kind of morphed into Chris Farley. And I was a fat man in a little coat. I mean, you could name all sorts of different things. And living in a van down by the river, and it just sort of stuck. So they just shortened it to Farley, and that's what I ended up with. And I just embraced it. So
as you should.
Yeah.
It's like a burr. The more you resist it, the further in it digs. And good on you. I mean, that's the point, right? I mean, it's a fun thing. It doesn't necessarily define us, but it kind of follows us around. So
yeah, absolutely.
Good stuff.
Yeah, I'm proud of it now. So
good. All right, Farley. Well, appreciate your time, and again, appreciate you sending me the book. I had to have you bring a copy in because I loaned it to a high school kid who's a friend of mine, and he's wanting to be a pilot like you were 20 years or however long ago it's been. So hopefully he'll find value in it. But thanks for your time. Thanks for helping us understand Top Gun Adversaries and your books today.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Jello.
Hey, thanks for watching this episode of the Fighter Pilot Podcast. I hope you enjoyed it and learned something new. I sure do every time. Now, in case we had some jargon there you didn't understand, go on over to fighterpilotpodcast.com, where we have a glossary, as well as musings, which are just our blogs, and some cool merchandise that you can check out as well. So we'll see you next time here on the Fighter Pilot Podcast. So long.